A brief video regarding the ethnogenesis of haplogroup J2b, L283, and its westward push across the Pontic-Caspian steppe into the Balkans starting around 4000 BCE. From the Galici et al., The Rise and Transformation of Bronze Age Pastoralists in the Caucasus study, the oldest J2b L283 ancient DNA sample discovered thus far is sample Z01002 from Zolotarevka, Russia, C14 dated to about 3900 BCE. This was archaeologically classified as either an early or pre-Yamnaya burial from a solitary kurgan in the northern portion of Stavropol Krai, Russia, near the states of Kalmykia and Rostov. Z01002 was buried with some very interesting burial inventory, which included a whetstone used for sharpening blades, along with a sulfur orb that was likely the byproduct of copper smelting. So this individual was likely an early metalsmith/copper worker out on the Pontic-Caspian steppe. In terms of Z01002's autosomal ancestry, he was modeled as a 50-50 split between steppe Neolithic and Caucasus Neolithic ancestry. This is a unique blend that places Z01002 on the intermediate portion of what is known as a Caucasus Lower Volga or CLV cline. About 26% of the ancestry found amongst the core Yamnaya comes from this intermediate portion of the CLV cline. It is widespread in Yamnaya, Afanasyevo, as well as sites south of the Caucasus presumed to have been Indo-Anatolian speakers. There were large chunks of IBD segment sharing that occurred between 4100 and 3900 BCE with samples from this intermediate portion of the CLV cline during the initial formation of core Yamnaya. So this admixture event is not defined by autosomal ancestry alone, but also IBD segment sharing that is precisely dated to the aforementioned date range. The role that this intermediate portion of the CLV cline played in terms of the formation of core Yamnaya is covered extensively in the study The Genetic Origin of the Indo-Europeans by Lazaridis, Reich, Patterson, and Anthony et al. The core Yamnaya underwent a founder event, likely somewhere between the Don and Dnipro rivers or between the Don and the lower Volga, starting around 3500 BCE. This founder event is clearly visible with J2b L283, where there are 6 branches atop the J2b L283 phylogenetic tree with formation dates of around 3500 BCE. This is the phylogenetic signature of a likely patriarchal chief who had many sons, and so on and so forth. These 6 branches are Z622, YP91, Z600, Y260401, Z2509, and Z585. It is unknown at this time which steppe archaeological complex is responsible for this founder event. The Repin culture, centered between the lower Volga and the middle Don, is one good candidate based on the similar 3500 BCE timestamp, or perhaps a late Sredny-Stog-derived group a bit further west between the Dnipro and Don rivers could also be a viable candidate. The significance of the core Yamnaya is that it is thought that the languages of the late Yamnaya, known as late Proto-Indo-European, are derived directly from this early core Yamnaya group/founder event. These languages would be Albanian, Armenian, and Greek via the Mycenaean Greeks. Illyrian and Mesopic would be examples of languages also associated with core Yamnaya, but have subsequently gone extinct. The vectors for these late Proto-Indo-European languages, to the exclusion of Armenian, into the Balkans was via the late Yamnaya, possibly even early Catacomb, by way of western Ukraine and Moldova. This brings us to Moldova and the Western Steppe, where 3 late Yamnaya J2b L283 ancient DNA samples have been discovered. They are I-10-206 from Krihanovik, Moldova, dated to about 2700 BCE, and then twin brothers. They are CGG_2_103750, as well as 103753 from Konstantinovka, Moldova, dated to approximately 2500 BCE. Sample I-10-206 from Krihanovik is likely a representative of the Budyak Yamnaya found there in the southwestern portion of Moldova near the Prut and Danube rivers. He is modeled as 84% core Yamnaya and 16% early European farmer ancestry, likely Trypillian derived. This was a kurgan burial, and his inhumation was determined to be the oldest in the kurgan. He was tall by Yamnaya standards, standing at least 1.81 meters, and classified as a robust Proto-Europid due to his large skeletal structure. He was also buried with an arrowhead made of Nistrian flint, which was likely sourced there locally in Moldova. He also had a perimortem fracture to his collarbone, perhaps an injury received in a battle or skirmish against a rival tribe that ultimately resulted in his death. I-10-206 was a low coverage sample, so unfortunately his terminal branch under J2b L283 is unknown at this time. The next samples from Moldova are CGG_2_103750 and 103753 from Konstantinovka in southeastern Moldova on the border with Ukraine as part of the Yedier et al. Preprint Ancient Genomics support deep divergence between Eastern and Western Mediterranean Indo-European languages. These Konstantinovka samples date to 2500 BCE. This is a Budiak Yamnaya Kurgan burial. They are modeled as 100% Yamnaya ancestry and have IBD sharing with ancient DNA sample log 04 from Logkis, Greece, dated to approximately 2300 BCE, which is thought to be representative of early Proto-Greeks and their migration between about 2500 and 2300 BCE from Moldova to Greece. In fact, the Yedier preprint models steppe ancestry in the Mycenaeans post-1800 BCE as being directly derived from early Bronze Age Moldova using R1b Z2103 and J2b L283 late Yamnaya samples from Cahul and Konstantinovka, respectively, as sources. The Konstantinovka samples are assigned to the Z597 branch of J2b L283, which has a formation date of around 3000 BCE and a TMRCA, or a time of most recent common ancestor, of 2500 BCE. The vast majority of people today who belong to J2b L283 belong to the Z597 branch. This brings us to the least controversial region of ancient DNA studies, the Balkans. The last major study that saw a large-scale data dump of ancient DNA samples from myriad sites from across the Balkans was the Genetic History of the Southern Arc, a bridge between West Asia and Europe, back in 2022. We're rapidly approaching 2027, which means it has been nearly half a decade since a large-scale study on the Balkans has been released. The Southern Arc study was a bit of a gold mine for J2b L283 research in the Balkans, with many ancient J2b L283 samples published from Albania, Montenegro, and Croatia from the Bronze Age and Iron Age, with many samples linked to the Cetina culture, as well as post-Cetina groups believed to be, in part, ancestral to the Mesopic and Illyrian people found throughout the Western Balkans and Italy. These West Balkan samples complemented the numerous Mesopic samples from throughout southeastern Italy, known as Apulia. This link is further bolstered by robust IBD segment sharing between Mesopic sample Neo 806, dated to about 1100 BCE, from Grotta della Mura, Italy, and various Cetina/post-Cetina samples in Albania, Montenegro, and Croatia. The Migdalia, Greece samples linked to early Mycenaeans under the Z615 branch of J2b L283, at least based on IBD sharing, show little overlap with West Balkan Cetina and post-Cetina samples. This is a bit of a surprise since Cetina expanded as far south as the Peloponnesus in southern Greece. Instead, the largest segment sharing is with Moldova Yamnaya and Ukraine Yamnaya, with intermittent small-scale sharing with Chalcolithic groups from Romania. Since the Migdalia samples were dated to 1600 BCE and the site contained matte painted pottery from the same time period, known as Migdalia I, it's possible that the Z615 Migdalia samples represent a southward movement of Greco-Phrygian speakers via the matte painted ware complex. Additionally, the aforementioned Yedier et al. Preprint contained a Mycenaean J2b L283 sample from Kirha, Greece, dated to 1600 BCE as well, this time under the Z600 branch. Thus, it appears that some of the older pre-Z597 branches of J2b L283 are associated, at least in part, with early Greek speakers moving into southern Greece from Moldova and western Ukraine. Since Z615, Migdalia, Greece, and Z600, Kirha, Greece, are slightly older branches when compared to Z597, One possibility is that this split between these older and younger branches somewhat mirrors the proposed linguistic tree from linguists Hillestead and Joseph for Balkan Indo-European languages, in this case the Greco-Albanian split. The older J2b L283 branches appear connected with the Greco-Phrygian branch, while those under Z597 are much more closely related to the Illyric branch, which includes Albanian and Mesopic speakers. Since IBD sharing links both groups with Western steppe herders, aka the Yamnaya, in Moldova and Ukraine, perhaps the Western steppe is the source of these Greco-Albanian languages, with Armenian developing further east between Crimea and the Kuban steppe of southwestern Russia in what is known as the Novo-Tudorovskaya culture. Finally, recent IBD analysis of sample ORC 008 from Sardinia, dated to about 1200 BCE, might offer some valuable clues about how several different lines of J2b L283 ended up being present amongst Nuragic-era Sardinians. There are numerous small-scale but frequent IBD hits between ORC 008 and various Chalcolithic groups in Croatia, Serbia, and Hungary. Additionally, there is IBD segment sharing between ORC 008 and an early catacomb culture sample from southwestern Russia. This might be the result of a slightly earlier movement of J2b L283 lineages into the Western Balkans via Yamnaya movements between 2900 and 2500 BCE, and an early integration into the Vuchedol sphere, rather than later Yamnaya movements closer to 2500 BCE associated with late and post-Vuchedol groups in the Western and Central Balkans. As waves of later Yamnaya pushed into the Western Balkans around 2500 BCE, these older J2b L283 lines may have been displaced to the Italian peninsula and then ultimately Sardinia. Obviously, we need many more ancient DNA samples from the early Bronze Age, stretching from eastern Romania to the Western Balkans and the eastern Adriatic, to be able to more precisely answer many of these questions. Nonetheless, research has steadily provided a useful framework and explanation for the movement of J2b L283 from the area around the Caucasus and the lower Volga into the Western Balkans, Italy, southern Greece, and beyond.